On a freezing night in Chicago, Sergeant Jack Turner lay bleeding out in a dark alley. His radio shattered, no backup in sight. His loyal K9 Rex stood guard, refusing to leave even as Jack's strength slipped away. What Rex did next would shock doctors, officers, and an entire city, a decision that turned the impossible into survival. This isn't just a story about a dog. It's about loyalty, intelligence, and a bond stronger than death itself. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and stay with us for the incredible story. Chicago's near West Side breathed like a sleeping animal. Steam climbing from the grates, a bus sighing at a corner. The last lights of a corner deli going out one by one. Sergeant Jack Turner watched the block settle from the driver's seat of an unmarked sedan, hands easy on the wheel shoulders squared in that quiet way veterans carry. He'd done this longer than he cared to remember different cities, same hour of night, when the streets felt honest enough to tell you what they were hiding. Beside him, Rex sat alert in the passenger footwell, a black and tan silhouette with eyes that held the room and wouldn't let it move. The mission order had said low-risk surveillance only. A small house wedged between a shuttered tire shop and a laundromat with a flickering sign. A suspected drop-point thin chatter about a new shipment, nothing more. He could hear Captain Cole's measured voice in his head. Get eyes, get patterns, come home. Jack had laughed softly, then the kind a man gives when he'd prefer to argue but knows better. The air smelled of cold metal and old rain. He cracked his window an inch. Rex lifted his muzzle toward the seam and sampled the night, his breath fogging the dash. A song from the 70s drifted from a second-floor apartment, the needle of a record hissing between verses. Somewhere a bottle clinked. The rest felt like a photograph, edges, sharp colors muted. Jack tapped his phone once to check the time and immediately felt foolish. He already knew it could feel the rhythm of the shift in his bones. A few minutes shy of midnight. He reached down and scratched the spot under Rex's collar that always softened the dog's posture an inch. Easy night, partner, he murmured. Rex's ears twitched, not in agreement so much as acknowledgement. They'd come on together the way some pairs are drawn. Jack with the steadiness of a man who'd buried noise overseas and learned to live with the quiet. Afterward, Rex with that sober intensity particular to working dogs who understand their purpose the way a compass understands north. The first hour followed the handbook. 2 figures entered the house at staggered intervals, one carrying a nylon duffel, one empty-handed. A late-model sedan idled lights off across from the laundromat, then slipped away. Jack logged plates, descriptions, times left-handed, smoker blue hoodie, limp in the right leg, details that would make sense later when patterns took shape. He nudged the radio mic with his knuckle and whispered a routine update to dispatch the kind of check-in that passes through the air unnoticed and keeps supervisors asleep. When he released the button, the car settled back into the hush of good posture. He sipped coffee that had given up on the idea of being hot and watched a young couple argue in gestures across the street, their breath silver in the light. The woman stepped away, then back, then away for good, and the man kicked at the curb, hit his own thigh with the heel of his palm, and finally walked north toward Lake Street like he'd been told to go there by some older version of himself. Jack let the scene fade. Surveillance teaches a person to love the ordinary, to catch it in transit and file it for later. Somewhere in the second hour, Rex changed the room. It wasn't dramatic. The dog shifted his weight, lifted his head, and set it again as if deciding whether to stand. His eyes cut to the rear view and held there a fraction too long. Jack straightened the way a soldier wakes without moving anything important. He followed Rex's gaze and saw only the empty shine of the streetlights caught in his own mirror. He listened. A box truck rumbled 2 blocks over. A flag clacked against a pole. Nothing broke the surface. "What do you have?" he whispered, not expecting an answer but asking anyway. Rex's ears lifted, then flattened. He exhaled a quiet push of air that sounded like a man deciding not to speak. Jack felt the familiar click in his mind that meant he'd stopped trusting the words low risk. He set the paper cup back in its holder and closed the window. Across the street, the suspected house lived behind drawn blinds. A figure passed by once, a cutout moving from one end of the room to the other. No music, no TV. The record upstairs had ended, leaving a turntable spinning in a tired circle. Jack decided to make a slow roll past the block to reset his angles. He turned the key, the engine coughed to life, and the dash lights drew soft semicircles in Rex's eyes. The dog braced his paws, balanced for motion. Jack eased out, stopped at the end of the lane, and took a right. The tires whispered over patched asphalt. He drove by the laundromat and checked the house in his side mirror the way it seemed to shrink when looked at from a distance. He kept the speed at 20, a number that never arrests attention. As he came around the far corner for a second pass, Rex's head snapped to the left. This time Jack saw it too. Not a person, not a car, but the absence of both a shaved bit of daylight between a pair of trash bins where there shouldn't be a corridor. He slowed, then decided against stopping. He would log it, swing another block, come back. The plan lasted to the next intersection. A delivery van drifted from a side street and settled behind them, unremarkable at first glance. White paint, no logo, a dent in the bumper that looked old. Jack felt the van's distance in his shoulders, counted to 5, and prepared to turn east, then drifted past his intended turn instead. The van continued as well. It could be nothing. It could be a man who finished an overnight restock picking his way back to the warehouse district. It could be a shadow attached to another story. Rex rose to a sit, chest forward, eyes fixed on Jack's mirror. Noted Jack breathed. He put another block between them and the suspect house, a technique that bought time without losing the thread. When he finally made the decision to circle back, he did it through a series of small choices: right, left, pause, roll like a man easing into cold water. The van peeled off. Jack let it go. He returned to the curb opposite the tire shop and set the car to idle, the dash glow settling on his knuckles. Rex lowered himself again, alert but patient, the way he could hold his readiness like a loaded spring without wasting a tremor. Jack scanned the block with fresh eyes. The house's blinds had changed. One slat lifted a hair, as if breath had caught it. He thumbed the mic, reported a minor anomaly, then paused with the mic still hovering, listening to the space between static. A gust pulled a newspaper free from a wire basket and sent it skittering along the sidewalk. The paper slapped a lamppost and folded into itself. The world kept its voice low. Jack measured his next move as a man measures a board before cutting. He considered requesting a secondary unit for a parallel angle, then decided the ask would tip their presence. Low risk, surveillance only. He settled into the long wait and let the street write its story. The night did not lunge, it drifted. 3 silhouettes came from the south, gave the house a wide berth, and continued north. A bicycle rattled past its rider, bundled in a coat too thin for the air. A cat made a dignified procession from beneath the tire shop gate and vanished into a storm drain without looking back. Rex kept that steady quiet that had carried Jack through the worst of nights. Afghan winters, a roadside dawn with the cold baked into the dirt, a base perimeter where the wind smelled like metal. Here now the same quiet placed a palm between him and the unknown and said, "Wait." Shortly after 1, a sedan with mismatched hubcaps slid to a stop in front of the house. The driver didn't kill the headlights. The passenger stepped out wearing a ball cap, pulled low, kept the door open with hip and forearm, and looked up and down the street in a way that had more math in it than curiosity. Jack sat very still. The passenger closed the door after too long, walked to the house, and lifted his hand to knock without making contact. The door opened. He entered. The sedan rolled forward half a car length and stayed. Jack's first instinct was to adjust his position. His second was to do nothing at all. He did the second. In the passenger footwell, Rex's claws clicked softly once on the vinyl, then went quiet. The dog's gaze tracked from the sedan to the house and back, not with impatience, but with an accountant's care. Jack felt a current move under the surface. Something not quite sound, not quite smell, the kind of pattern you notice only because you've kept track of thousands. He spoke softly into the mic updated times and descriptions, then added one sentence he rarely used, requesting a slow drift by any unit within 4 blocks. No lights, no sound. He let the radio rest in its cradle, and even before dispatch answered, he knew the reply would be delayed. This hour, this district, these calls stacked like loose paper. He studied the dark windows of the laundromat and saw himself reflected there, a man inside a car, inside a job, inside a long line of nights. He cleared his throat, a quiet cough that belonged to the car more than to him. In the house across the street, a light flicked on in the front room, then off. Jack counted the beats. 3, 4, 5. He lost the number when a second vehicle drifted in from the east, the kind of slow approach that pretends to be accidental. It paused half a car length behind Jack, then continued another 20 feet and parked. No one exited. Jack lowered his chin and breathed shallow eyes forward, the crown of his head tingling the way it had on a ridge line when the world had gone too quiet. Rex lifted his muzzle, the muscles along his shoulders tightening, and pressed his nose to the thin slice of air at the window seam, drawing in a measured scent and sorting it. He didn't vocalize. He didn't need to. Jack read the dog the way some men read weather, and what he read was not fear, not even urgency, but an alignment of facts that pointed one direction. They were being noticed in return. He let the knowledge settle. Low risk had stepped aside. Observation had turned to invitation. The street had stopped telling its story and was waiting to hear theirs. Jack slid his palm across the gear shift without moving it and let his fingertips rest there. He didn't glance at Rex. He didn't have to. "Okay," he whispered, and the word was not concession or command. It was a man making room for what would come. The street outside the suspected house remained suspended in a stillness that felt heavier than air, and Sergeant Jack Turner adjusted slightly in his seat, one hand still resting on the gear shift, as if he could steady the entire car through touch alone, while Rex remained statuesque beside him, ears cocked toward a sound no human could quite detect. Then, almost without warning, the stillness ruptured when the front door of the house across the street flew open with a burst of movement, and Jack's instincts sharpened in less than a heartbeat as 2 figures poured out their steps, purposeful, their arms tight against their sides in a way that spoke more of concealed weapons than casual errand. Jack leaned forward to watch through the windshield, his breath shallow as he logged every motion, but before he could reach for his mic, a third figure appeared in the doorway and raised a short firearm, with a motion so practiced it carried no hesitation. And the world slowed to that dreadful pause soldiers recognize as the moment between sight and consequence. The first shot came with a thunder that bounced between buildings, and Jack felt the impact tear across his body before his mind had even placed the sound. The bullet found his abdomen just below the vest, and in the split second that followed, the hot force stole the breath from his lungs and sent his body collapsing backward into the driver's seat, eyes wide with the disbelieving recognition of pain. Rex erupted in an instant, barking with a fury that belonged to guardians bred for centuries, his body lurching forward toward the glass claws raking the dashboard as if he could tear through the barrier between them and the threat. Jack groaned low, one hand clutching his side as warmth spread under his palm, the sickly, unmistakable heat of blood soaking his shirt and vest, his thoughts already narrowing to the singular question of survival. He reached clumsily for the radio mounted by the console, intending to send an officer down call. But as his trembling fingers brushed the device, a second shot cracked. The night glass shattered across the dash and sparks flared from the radio unit as a stray round ripped through it, leaving behind the acrid scent of burnt plastic and metal, the only lifeline to backup destroyed in a blink. Jack's breath hitched his ribs burning with every gasp, and the enormity of his isolation pressed down. No radio, no immediate allies, only Rex standing sentinel. The attackers ducked back into the house, leaving the street oddly bare again, as if the violence had been a whisper carried by the wind. But Jack knew better than to believe they were gone, because ambushes never ended at the first shot. They lingered and circled, waiting for weakness to widen the door. Rex turned, pressed close to Jack's leg, his brown eyes searching his handler's face with an intelligence that seemed to demand instruction, but Jack could not summon more than a broken whisper. "Stay. Stay." And he pressed his head back against the seat, sweat gathering along his hairline. The car's interior smelled of iron and shattered plastic, each breath growing shorter as pain carved deeper into him. He tried to apply pressure with one hand, his other sliding uselessly against the fractured edge of the radio unit. But the truth said in cold help would not be coming through wires tonight. Rex whined once, then shifted his body toward the broken window, his gaze locked on the shadows beyond the glass ears, twitching at every faint echo down the street. Jack could hear the faraway hum of a vehicle not close enough to matter, and the beating of his own pulse, uneven, desperate. He wondered for an instant if this was how it ended on a street that smelled of wet asphalt in the city he had served faithfully, his only witness, a dog who would not leave him. He remembered a briefing long ago, another handler telling recruits that when you go down in the field, your canine will do one of two things: fight to the death or find help. Jack blinked against the blur of his vision, uncertain which path Rex would take, but silently hoping the dog would be wise enough to choose the latter, because every passing second thinned the thread that tied him to consciousness. His eyes flicked to the house again, noting the faintest shift of blinds, the promise of enemies still watching, and he gritted his teeth against the spiral of weakness threatening to swallow him. He forced one more command, a whisper pressed out between clenched lips. "Rex, go." His hand slid from the wound for a fraction of a second to press against the dog's shoulder, urging motion. Rex hesitated, caught between the command he had been trained to obey and the loyalty he was born to honor. Jack's vision blurred further, the lamplight outside spinning into halos, the sound of his own heartbeat loud in his ears. He knew he was losing too much blood too fast, and that without intervention the night would close its hands around him before long. His last clear image was Rex standing tall inside the car nose, pressed to the jagged gap in the shattered window muscles, taut as if calculating the entire street in a language older than words. Jack's body sagged into the seat, his hand slipping away from the wound, his lips parting in a silent groan. The dog turned back once, eyes locking with his handler's fading gaze, then lifted his head high as though making a decision. The world around Jack blurred, but the knowledge remained etched sharp inside his dimming mind. Whatever happened next would be written not by him, not by the radio, but by the dog who refused to abandon him. The night clung to the narrow street like a heavy blanket, muffling every sound except the shallow gasps coming from Sergeant Jack Turner as he lay slumped against the driver's seat. One hand pressed desperately against the wound in his abdomen, while Rex, his K9 partner, hovered inches away with a stance that radiated both urgency and defiance, his chest rising and falling quickly as he tried to decide between instinct and training. Jack's lips moved with effort, the words scraping out as barely more than a whisper. "Go, Rex. Go. Find help." His voice carrying all the weight of command sharpened by years of partnership. But his hand trembled as he pushed weakly toward the door, a gesture meant to free the dog from his side. Rex, however, did not move toward escape. He stayed rooted in place, his body angled protectively between Jack and the shattered window, ears pricked forward toward the hostile silence outside, his growl, low and steady, more a warning to unseen watchers than an answer to his handler. Jack's fading eyes tried to focus on his partner, frustration and desperation flickering in them as he repeated the order with more urgency, his throat straining for sound. "Go, Rex." But again the dog refused his loyalty, outweighing every ounce of training drilled into him to obey. For a long minute, the only sounds were Jack's ragged breathing and the faint drip of blood pattering onto the car floor, and in that dim space, Rex seemed to study his handler's condition, nose dipping close to Jack's face as if measuring each faltering breath, each stuttering heartbeat. The scent of blood filled Rex's nostrils, sharp and metallic, and it told him what no words could. His partner was weakening too quickly, his life ebbing away with every passing second, and staying to guard without action would mean losing him. Rex shifted muscles tense, eyes darting from the wound to the street and back again, caught in a silent calculation that weighed the meaning of obedience against the chance of survival. When Jack's head sagged to the side and his hand slipped from the wound, the dog made his choice. With a swift turn, Rex pressed his body against the car door, forcing it open wider with his weight, and leapt into the cold air, his paws striking the pavement with precision. He paused only once to glance back through the broken window at his fallen partner, a soundless promise flashing in his eyes. Then he launched forward into the night. The city greeted him with a maze of alleys and half-lit streets, the glow of distant traffic lights painting his fur in fleeting colors as he sprinted his nose high to catch familiar scents. He knew the rhythms of the district from countless patrols, and his mind mapped possible paths toward the nearest officers. Every step echoed with urgency, claws scraping asphalt, muscles driving harder than any training session, because tonight was not about drills or commands. It was about saving the man who had trusted him since the first day they met. Rex darted past trash bins, hurtled over a low fence, and cut sharply through a vacant lot where broken glass crunched under his paws, his ears constantly swiveling for the sound of pursuit. Somewhere behind him, danger still lingered, but he focused on the task ahead. Find help, lead them back, do not stop. His chest heaved, but he pushed faster, each stride pulling him deeper into the city's arteries. He passed a shuttered grocery with its neon sign half lit, then a dark playground where swings swayed slightly in the breeze, landmarks he barely registered as his mind worked like an unbroken thread linking scent, memory, and destination. When the faint smell of gasoline and leather reached him, Rex slowed, nose tracing the air until the familiar overlay of Officer Mark Daniels' scent separated from the city's noise. He turned sharply toward it, weaving through parked cars until his sharp eyes caught the outline of a patrol vehicle idling near the corner. The figure of Daniels stood outside the cruiser, radio in hand, speaking quietly into it, unaware that the night had shifted. Rex bounded forward, barking once, a deep, commanding sound meant to cut through distraction. Daniels jerked his head, surprised, his brows furrowing at the sight of the dog alone. "Rex, what are you doing here?" he muttered, confusion threading his voice as he looked around for Jack. The dog closed the distance in seconds, lunged toward him, and clamped his jaws onto the sleeve of Daniels's jacket, tugging insistently backward in the direction he had come. Daniels stumbled, alarm flashing across his face as he tried to pull free. "Easy, boy. What's wrong?" he asked, but Rex growled low, his eyes burning with urgency as he pulled harder. The officer frowned, realizing this was no random escape. The dog was calling him, demanding him to follow. Daniel's training tugged at his instincts, urging him to pay attention, and his pulse quickened as he scanned the empty street for clues. Rex barked again, short and sharp, before turning his body fully toward the route back to Jack muscles, quivering with the need to run. Daniels tightened his grip on his flashlight and reached for his sidearm, the weight of responsibility settling heavily. "All right, show me," he whispered, voice taut with the understanding that something far worse waited down the line. Rex surged forward immediately, Daniels sprinting behind him, their footsteps pounding together into the silence of the city as the dog led his only hope back toward a man bleeding out alone. The night pressed close around the streets as Rex ran with the weight of urgency in every stride, his paws striking the uneven pavement in perfect rhythm, his ears filtering the countless sounds that lived inside the city after midnight. Behind him, Officer Mark Daniels pushed hard to keep pace, his breath coming fast, his boots slapping the ground with a steady beat. his eyes locked on the silhouette of the German shepherd that seemed to know every turn without hesitation. The alleyways of Chicago were not kind at this hour. Shadows clung stubbornly. Smells collided garbage oil food, long gone cold, and faint voices drifted from windows cracked just enough to leak arguments and lullabies. Yet Rex never wavered his senses, honed to a single thread, the need to bring help to Sergeant Jack Turner, before the silence in his chest became permanent. They cut down a narrow passage lined with overflowing bins, the moonlight barely reaching past the rusted fire escapes, and that was when Rex halted so abruptly that Daniels nearly collided with him. The dog's body lowered shoulders, tense, nose lifted toward the air, as a new scent sliced through the night. Daniels froze his hand, moving instinctively to the holster at his side, eyes searching the gloom ahead. A shape emerged at the far end of the alley, a man holding a short-barreled weapon, his posture deliberate, his gaze sweeping the darkness with the precision of someone expecting pursuit. Rex emitted a single deep growl, his tail stiff, but he did not lunge forward. Instead, he turned his head sharply toward a side alley branching off to the right, barked with sudden intensity, and bolted a few steps in that direction, as if giving chase to something unseen. The armed lookout jerked his head, startled by the bark his attention pulled toward the false lead, and without hesitation he began moving toward the alley. Rex had indicated his weapon, raised his back momentarily vulnerable. Seizing the distraction, Rex swung back with remarkable speed, slipping past Daniels and darting down the original path, his paws silent against the broken pavement. Daniels, catching the plan in a rush of realization, followed immediately, his heart pounding with the recognition that the dog had not only avoided unnecessary confrontation, but had also protected their fragile mission. They sprinted past the point of danger, the sound of the lookout's footsteps fading into the distance as he pursued the decoy, unaware that the real quarry had vanished from reach. Rex's breathing came quick but steady, his focus unbroken as he guided Daniels deeper into the city's grid. The officer marveled inwardly at the calculation displayed in that brief encounter, a tactical choice not to fight, but to mislead an instinct sharper than many seasoned officers could claim. The streets opened wider as they moved out of the cramped alley system and into a neighborhood where storefronts slept behind iron shutters and the sodium lamps cast their tired glow across cracked sidewalks. Rex's nose worked tirelessly, catching fragments of familiar scents among the chaos gasoline oil, the faint leather polish used on department vehicles, and with a sudden burst of certainty, he veered left, pulling Daniels toward a broader avenue. The officer staggered for balance, but trusted the dog's instincts, gripping his flashlight tight, though he left it dark to avoid drawing attention. As they reached the corner, Rex slowed, nose pressed low to the ground, weaving in a small pattern like a needle threading cloth. His tail gave a quick twitch, and then he surged forward again, following an invisible trail that no human eye could read. Daniels felt a flicker of hope rising in his chest, despite the sweat burning his face. The dog was leading them somewhere specific. Moments later, a glimmer of light reflected off glass caught Rex's attention, and he quickened his pace, pulling Daniels into the mouth of a side street. There, parked beneath a swaying street lamp, sat the unmistakable shape of a patrol car, its blue stripe dull under the tired glow, its engine faintly ticking as if it had recently been shut off. The sight hit Daniels like a lifeline. He recognized the car as one belonging to Unit 6, another team scheduled to patrol the district tonight. He glanced down at Rex, whose eyes glimmered with triumph, and understood fully that the dog had not only tracked him earlier, but was capable of isolating the scent markers of fellow officers, even in a city saturated with noise and distraction. Daniels jogged forward, raising his hand to signal, while Rex bounded ahead, barking once the sound sharp and purposeful rather than frantic. The patrol car's driver's side door opened cautiously, another officer stepping out with wary eyes and a hand near his holster. Confusion tightening his features at the sight of Rex leading Daniels. Daniels lifted his voice, firm but urgent. "We've got an officer down. Sergeant Turner. Shot in the abdomen. We need immediate support and medics now." The other officer's expression shifted instantly from suspicion to alarm, and he leaned back into the car to call for medical response. Rex paced in a tight circle near the cruiser, his body vibrating with impatience, his eyes flicking back toward the direction he had come, every line of him communicating the urgency of returning before it was too late. Daniels rested one hand on the dog's shoulder to steady him, whispering, "We'll get him, boy. We'll get him," even as his own pulse hammered with dread over how little time they might have left. Rex gave a low whine, then fixed his eyes once more on the dark streets behind them, ready to retrace the path and bring help to the man who lay bleeding and waiting. The cold air hung thick with the scent of gasoline and iron as Rex circled the parked patrol car, his paws scraping lightly against the pavement, his body bristling with impatience. Officer Mark Daniels leaned heavily on his knees, breath sharp from the run, and raised his hand toward the officer who had just stepped out of Unit 6's cruiser. The officer was young, his features drawn with suspicion, his brow furrowed at the sight of the canine thrashing back and forth, barking with intensity that rattled the quiet street. "Is this your dog, Daniels?" the officer asked with disbelief, his voice wavering between confusion and annoyance, because Rex's behavior appeared wild and unrestrained, unlike the disciplined canines he was used to seeing on controlled calls. Daniels shook his head, still catching his breath. "He's Turner's partner, not mine. He found me. He brought me here." But the younger officer frowned deeper, watching Rex lunge at his sleeve and pull, interpreting the frantic urgency as a dog that had slipped its leash. He muttered, "Looks like he broke free. We'll need to get him back under control before he hurts someone." He reached instinctively toward the dog's collar, intending to restrain him, but Rex snapped his head away, barked loud and sharp, then threw his weight against the officer's side in a desperate push to force movement. Daniels straightened quickly, his instincts prickling as he studied Rex more closely. The shepherd's actions were not random, not the behavior of a dog drunk on freedom. There was a pattern in the urgency, a direction in the pull. Still, the younger officer resisted stepping back with unease as Rex clamped his jaws lightly around the cuff of his jacket, tugging hard enough to drag him a step forward. "Hey, easy," the man protested, shaking his arm free, but Rex barked again, a deep, commanding sound that echoed off the buildings and refused to be ignored. Daniel's heart raced as he realized the animal was not misbehaving at all. He was communicating. Rex barked once more, shorter this time, then pivoted his body toward the darkened streets he had come from, ears, flat tail, rigid eyes burning with intent. The officer hesitated, still unconvinced, but Rex surged back toward him this time, seizing the strap of his radio and yanking it down so forcefully that the device slipped against the man's chest. Shock widened the officer's eyes as the dog growled low, staring at him as if demanding he understand. Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Listen, he's not loose. He's telling us Turner's hurt. That's why he found me. That's why he brought us here. Look at him. He's not trying to run. He's trying to lead." The younger officer blinked, his hand hovering uncertainly near his sidearm, but as he studied Rex more carefully, the truth began to pierce his assumptions. The shepherd's movements had precision. The pulls, the barks, the insistent circles all pointed in one direction. He was not chaotic. He was urgent. Daniels pressed harder, his tone steady. "He doesn't have time to wait for us to figure this out. Sergeant Turner's bleeding out right now somewhere out there. If we ignore this, we'll lose him." The officer swallowed, glancing at Rex again as the dog let out another whine, pawing at the ground, tail stiff, the kind of sound that throbbed with desperation. Finally, the man's expression shifted from doubt to recognition, the heavy weight of realization settling on his features. "All right," he said firmly, pulling his radio to his mouth. "Officer down, possible ambush. Medical assistance needed west sector near the laundromat on Ashland, following K9 lead." Rex barked sharply once more, then turned on his heels and bolted toward the path he had taken earlier. Daniels sprinting right behind him, the second officer close at their side. now no longer doubting but driven by the urgency of a shared mission. Their footsteps thundered against the pavement, and the city seemed to lean in with them, every shadow watching, as 3 figures, 2 men, and a determined shepherd plunged back into the night. Rex ran harder than before, his chest heaving, but his pace relentless, his claws striking sparks from the asphalt. The scent of Jack Turner clung faintly in his memory, like an unbroken thread, guiding him back through alleys and around corners with perfect certainty. Daniels marveled at the dog's unerring sense, his conviction strengthening with every block they crossed. He could feel the seconds slipping through their hands like water, each one bringing them closer to the edge of too late. They reached the end of a narrow passage where shadows gathered thick, and Rex halted suddenly, nose to the ground, tail stiff as he confirmed the fading scent trail. He lifted his head toward Daniels and barked once sharp before surging forward again, his urgency pulling them deeper toward the place where Jack still lay. Daniels' hand tightened around his radio, his other hovering near his weapon as he kept stride, his mind racing with the reality that the next turn could bring either rescue or confrontation. But whatever waited ahead, he knew they had no choice but to trust Rex, the one partner who had already proven he understood more than anyone else alive in that moment. Rex surged through the dimly lit streets with Officer Mark Daniels close behind the younger patrolman, now convinced of the urgency that burned in every movement of the K-9. Another officer from Unit 6 followed a few steps back, his radio still crackling with repeated calls for medical assistance, the clipped tones of dispatchers trying to coordinate an emergency response. The sound of their boots echoed through the alleys, but above it all was Rex's relentless rhythm, his paws pounding like a drumbeat, leading them closer to Sergeant Jack Turner. Every turn brought them deeper into the shadow of danger, and Daniel's mind sharpened with the knowledge that time was bleeding away as surely as Jack's life was. The night, however, was not yielding. At the mouth of an alley 2 blocks from their destination, movement stirred sharp and deliberate, and the dark figures of armed men appeared emerging from behind parked cars and broken fences. These were not startled bystanders. These were the same criminals who had fired the first shots, doubling back with the grim intent to finish what they had started. Daniel saw the glint of metal in their hands, the unmistakable silhouette of weapons rising, and his heart thudded once with icy recognition. They had been waiting for the chance to intercept. Rex saw them too, his instincts flaring with the clarity of pure duty. Without hesitation, the shepherd veered ahead of the officers and planted himself squarely in the middle of the narrow passage, fur-bristling chest forward, his bark erupting in a deafening roar that echoed off brick walls. The sudden ferocity startled the gunmen for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Daniels and the second officer to pull their sidearms free and raise them into a steady aim. "Police, drop it!" Daniels shouted, his voice firm, carrying the authority of both training and desperation. But the gunman hesitated, shifting one, raising his weapon higher, while another darted to the side as if to flank. Rex lunged forward a step, snapping his jaws, his bark splitting the tension like a blade. The gunman faltered, eyes flicking between the officers and the dog, their brief uncertainty a priceless gift in the narrow timeline of survival. Daniels took the opening, sweeping his aim across the men, his finger steady on the trigger, his words cutting sharp through the night. Back away now. The second officer mirrored his stance, his own weapon trained on the nearest figure. Rex advanced another step, his body a wall of resolve, every line of him radiating the promise that he would not allow them closer to his fallen handler. The standoff stretched taut every second, measured against the pulse of urgency in Daniels's throat. Then one of the criminals cursed under his breath and raised his weapon higher, a movement that cracked the fragile balance. Daniels shouted again, this time with steel in his voice, and the officers pressed forward, their weapons locked on target. Rex seized the moment, his bark exploding with such force that the gunman flinched, lowering his stance instinctively. The officers rushed the final steps, and the gunmen, realizing the shift in momentum, retreated with stumbling speed, slipping back into the darkness they had emerged from. Daniels's lungs burned as he exhaled hard, keeping his aim steady until the figures vanished beyond sight. Rex stood his ground, growling low, his body still taut with readiness, but he did not pursue. Instead, he cast a sharp glance back toward Daniel's eyes alive with urgency, as if to say there was no time to waste on chasing shadows. Daniels nodded quickly, holstering his weapon just long enough to touch his radio. Suspects sighted and retreated, continuing to officer down. He reported his words clipped efficient. He looked back at Rex, who was already surging forward again, nose lowered, body streamlined for speed. Daniels and the second officer followed, adrenaline still surging in their veins. They passed through the alley where the confrontation had just occurred, broken bottles crunching under their feet, the air thick with the residue of tension, and then they pressed deeper into the district where every block looked more desolate than the last. Rex darted around a corner, his pace quickening as the scent of Jack Turner grew stronger in his nostrils, guiding him with an invisible thread back toward the man who still fought to breathe. Daniels pushed harder lungs, straining sweat dripping into his eyes, but he never lost sight of the shepherd. The younger officer, shaken but resolute, tightened his grip on his radio and muttered to himself as if steadying his courage. "We're going to make it." The sound of distant sirens finally began to pierce the city's quiet faint at first, but growing closer, the promise of paramedics rushing to intercept. Rex barked once at the sound, a deep note of recognition, then pressed on, determined to reach Jack before time ran out. Daniel's chest heaved as he followed the echoes of the confrontation still fresh in his ears, but inside him a flame of hope flickered brighter. They had not been too late yet. They still had a chance. And as Rex rounded the final corner that would lead them back to the place where Jack lay, Daniels steeled himself for what they might find, whether his partner was still clinging to life, or whether the night had already claimed him. Rex tore around the final corner, his body a blur of muscle and urgency, and the two officers followed with weapons still drawn, their eyes darting to every shadow as if expecting another ambush. But what waited at the end of the alley was worse than any opponent. Sergeant Jack Turner lay sprawled halfway in the front seat of the unmarked car, his body slumped at an unnatural angle, his head tilted against the steering wheel, his shirt soaked through with blood that glistened dark under the streetlight. Daniel's heart seized at the sight, and he sprinted forward shouting Jack, though he knew instinctively that his partner could not hear him. The second officer rushed to secure the perimeter, his voice crackling over the radio as he called for the ambulance to expedite. Daniels dropped to his knees beside Jack, pressing 2 fingers against his neck, searching desperately for a pulse. What he found was faint, a whisper of life that flickered beneath skin clammy with blood loss. Jack's chest moved only slightly, shallow breaths that rattled like paper against wind, his face pale and still. "Stay with me." Daniels murmured, his own voice trembling despite years of training. His hands pressed against the wound, but the blood seeped stubbornly through, warm and relentless, staining his gloves within seconds. Beside him, Rex leapt into action with an urgency that spoke of understanding beyond words. The shepherd placed both front paws against Jack's chest and pressed lightly, then nosed at his chin, whining deep in his throat. When Jack did not respond, Rex licked furiously at his face, his tongue swiping across the cold skin, each touch insistent, each attempt a plea for his partner to come back. Daniels blinked hard, realizing that Rex was not panicking. He was stimulating. He had seen medical trainers use similar techniques to trigger reflexes, but here the dog acted on instinct, refusing to let Jack slip away. Daniels pressed harder on the wound, trying to stem the bleeding, his eyes flicking toward the end of the alley, where sirens finally grew louder, echoing between the walls like a promise racing closer. "Hold on, Jack. Help's coming," he whispered, his voice raw. Rex shifted again, pawing gently at Jack's shoulder, then licking near his mouth as if urging him to breathe. For one terrifying moment, Daniels thought the effort was futile. Jack's chest stilled, his lips parted with no sound, but then faintly a shallow cough rattled through him, a tiny flicker of resistance. Daniels felt it beneath his fingers, the pulse skipping but not gone, and relief surged through him even as dread tightened his throat. Rex barked once sharp and commanding, his eyes blazing as he looked at Daniels as though demanding that he not give up. The seconds stretched long until red and white lights finally painted the brick walls of the alley, and the ambulance skidded into place with practiced urgency. 2 paramedics leapt out, bags in hand, their eyes narrowing instantly at the sight of Jack's limp form. Critical abdominal wound, pulse, faint, shallow respirations, Daniels reported quickly as he shifted aside to give them space. 1 paramedic dropped to the ground, ripping open supplies while the other set up oxygen. Rex refused to move far, pacing in a tight circle around Jack, whining and nudging until Daniels grabbed his collar and whispered, "Easy, boy. Let them work." The paramedic slid gauze against the wound, replacing Daniels' soaked gloves, while another started an IV line with swift precision. "He's crashing one of them," said grimly, and for a moment the alley filled with the frantic cadence of medical commands. Rex barked again, loud enough to jolt Jack's head slightly, and in that instant the paramedic's hand caught the tiniest twitch of response in Jack's arm. "He's still with us," the medic said, tightening the bandage and signaling for the stretcher. Daniels exhaled shakily, glancing at Rex, who now pressed his head against Jack's chest, ears pinned back but eyes unyielding, refusing to accept silence. Together they lifted Jack onto the stretcher, his body limp but not lifeless, the monitors strapped to him, spiking faintly with each shallow breath. The paramedics wheeled him quickly toward the ambulance, one hand pumping oxygen, another pressing firm against the bandage that now bloomed red within seconds. Rex lunged forward to follow, nearly dragging Daniels, his claws scraping sparks from the asphalt. "He's going with us," Daniels told the medics firmly, when one looked hesitant, and seeing the determination in both man and dog, they allowed it. The stretcher slid into the back of the ambulance, Rex climbing in immediately to press against Jack's side. Daniels climbed in after them, heart still hammering, his radio pressed to his ear as he updated Captain Cole. The paramedic shouted vitals as the doors slammed shut, the sirens flaring to life, propelling them forward into the night. Daniels looked down at Jack's pale face, then at Rex, curled tight against him, and whispered a prayer that they had not been too late. The dog's steady pressure and unyielding devotion had kept the faint spark alive long enough for help to arrive. Now the fight would continue inside the rushing ambulance, each second balanced between loss and survival. The ambulance tore through the night, its sirens wailing, lights flashing red and white across the windows of shuttered shops and darkened homes, while inside the confined space, paramedics worked frantically over Sergeant Jack Turner. His body shook with every bump of the road, his skin pale and cold beneath the harsh fluorescent glow monitors chirping with erratic beeps that told the story of a life slipping away. Rex crouched at Jack's side, his paws braced against the floor, his eyes never leaving his partner's face, his body tense as the medics inserted lines and applied pressure. Officer Mark Daniels clung to the handrail above his knuckles, white, his gaze locked on the rise and fall of Jack's chest, which came shallow and uneven as though each breath was a question. The driver's voice carried through the small intercom from the front, announcing every sharp turn, every crossing. The sound steady until suddenly the world jolted with violent force. Tires screeched, metal groaned, and the ambulance swerved hard to the right as another car running a red light shot across the intersection. The driver slammed the brakes, the vehicle lurching so sharply that Daniels was thrown against the side wall. For a terrifying second, the ambulance tilted before shuddering back onto its wheels, the sirens still crying out into the night. Inside, equipment clattered, trays rattled, and one medic grabbed the stretcher rails with both hands to keep Jack from rolling off balance. The driver's voice came through again, shaken but steady. "We're still moving. Hold tight." But the air in the cabin had shifted. Jack's monitor let out a long, alarming tone as his fragile heartbeat slipped further, dipping into a rhythm so faint it nearly vanished. "He's crashing," one medic shouted, fumbling for the defibrillator, his partner preparing chest pads with swift efficiency. Daniels' stomach dropped at the sound, but Rex reacted faster, springing up and pressing his body across Jack's chest as if refusing to let go. The medics glanced in surprise, instinctively moving to pull the dog back, but Daniels raised a hand sharply. "Wait. Give him a second," he said, his voice hoarse with urgency. Rex adjusted his weight carefully, laying himself down so that his chest pressed directly against Jack's, his head resting near Jack's shoulder, his breath warm against his handler's neck. The shepherd's heartbeat thudded strong and steady, a rhythm carved by years of discipline, and for a moment the cabin fell into an uncanny quiet, broken only by the syncopation of the dog's breathing and the monitor's faltering beeps. Seconds passed, then the machine gave a faint flicker registering a hesitant echo of Rex's steady cadence. The medic looked at the monitor, startled. "He's sinking," he muttered, disbelief in his tone. Daniels leaned closer, his eyes wide as he watched the line wobble, then catch slightly in step with the pressure of Rex's body. The shepherd whined low, nudged Jack's chin gently with his nose, then settled heavier against him, as though anchoring his partner to the world. The medic at the defibrillator placed pads on Jack's chest, calling out the charge, his partner clearing the space, and Daniels pulled back just enough to let them work, while Rex remained draped across Jack, unyielding in his vigil. "Charging." "Clear," the medic commanded, and a jolt coursed through Jack's body, the stretcher shaking under the sudden surge. The monitor screamed with a flat line, then hiccuped, a faint beat flickering through, then another fragile but real. Again the medic called, his voice firmer. "Charging." "Clear." And the second shock sent Jack's body arching before slumping back. The monitor caught once more this time, registering a hesitant but steady rhythm. "We've got him," the medic said, relief softening his features. Rex lifted his head, ears pricked, eyes locked on the monitor, as though he too understood what those faint beeps meant. He shifted to lick Jack's face once, then pressed his body back down across his handler's chest, unwilling to yield the position that had given them precious seconds to hold life in place. Daniels sat back against the wall, his breath unsteady, the magnitude of what he had just witnessed settling like a stone in his chest. He whispered, barely audible, "You saved him, boy. You really saved him." The ambulance roared on the driver, pushing harder, now his knuckles no doubt white on the wheel as city streets blurred past. Every bump rattled the stretcher, but the rhythm on the monitor grew steadier, fragile but clinging. The medics worked to stabilize Jack, inserting fluids, adjusting oxygen, while one kept an eye on the monitor with a glance that carried both hope and caution. Rex remained motionless but alert, his ears twitching at every sound, his chest pressed firmly against the man who had trusted him with everything. As the hospital's lights finally appeared on the horizon, glowing faintly against the sky, Daniels let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They had survived the crash, they had survived the flatline, and Jack Turner was still with them, tethered to the world by the stubborn loyalty of a dog who refused to let go. The hospital lights did not welcome, they glared cold and merciless, bleaching every hallway into a colorless stretch of tile and glass. The doors of the ambulance flew open, and Sergeant Jack Turner's stretcher was pulled into that brilliance, his body pale beneath layers of blood-soaked bandages. Doctors converged instantly, a storm of white coats and clipped orders filling the sterile air. But what caught the eyes of nurses first was not the stretcher. It was Rex. The German shepherd moved with the team as though he belonged to them, his shoulders low, his gaze locked on the man they wheeled toward the ICU. No command could turn him away. He pressed forward, muscles taut, unwilling to surrender his post even within the fortress of medicine. Inside the ICU machines, word and monitors beeped erratic warnings, each one echoing the fragility of life stretched too thin. Dr. Emily Harris, calm yet grave, took charge. "Stabilize him for now. Prep surgical support, we need to hold what we can," she said, her voice clear, her hands already working. Officers could only watch from the glass outside, including Mark Daniels, his heart hammering as he saw his partner's chest rise shallowly, weaker with every minute. As doctors worked, the quieter voices of young residents leaked into the corridor. The coma could last indefinitely, one whispered. If he even makes it through tonight. Their words struck Daniels like a blade, but Rex responded with fury. The dog barked sharply, a deep, commanding sound that silenced even the whispers of doubt. Heads turned. For a moment it seemed as if the shepherd had spoken for his handler, refusing to allow despair to stand within reach of Jack Turner. Hours passed in the suspended hush of fluorescent light. The beeping monitor became the only rhythm in the room. Nurses brought new fluids, adjusted lines, checked vitals. Rex never moved from his station at the bed, his chin resting gently against Jack's arm, his ears twitching at every faint sound. He growled softly when someone suggested moving him away. He had chosen his post, and he would not abandon it. Then it happened. The faintest twitch across Jack's fingers so slight it could be mistaken for a trick of light. Rex caught it instantly. He surged to his feet, barking with such force that every nurse turned. One hurried to the bedside, her voice sharp with urgency. Doctor movement. Dr. Harris leaned forward, scanning both patient and monitor. The screen flickered reflex or intention. It did not matter. It was life. Rex whined urgently, licking Jack's hand, nudging his arm, unwilling to let the moment slip. Again the fingers stirred a fragile curl, then a shallow catch of breath. Nurses scrambled to recalibrate, noting every sign, their hurried notes now tinged with something foreign in the ICU hope. Daniels pressed his palm against the glass, his throat tightening as relief burned in his chest. Dr. Harris rested a hand briefly on Rex's head, her voice low enough for only him to hear. Good work. The shepherd stood tall, ears, sharp eyes unwavering his presence, a reminder that loyalty can be stronger than despair. Machines continued their steady chorus, but now each beep carried possibility. Jack Turner was still in the fight, and it was Rex who made sure the world knew it. The ICU held its breath in a silence so deep that every beep of the monitor seemed louder than it should be, every sigh of the ventilator like the shifting of the earth itself. Sergeant Jack Turner had lain motionless for days, his chest rising with the rhythm of machines rather than his own will, while doctors balanced his fragile state on the edge of possibility. Dr. Emily Harris had told the staff not to expect a sudden recovery, only the slow passage of time that might or might not lead him back. Yet Rex had never once left his side. The shepherd stayed pressed against the bed, his head on Jack's arm, his steady heartbeat a constant companion. Nurses worked around him, understanding now that he was more guardian than patient, more necessary than any IV stand. Officers from the precinct visited quietly, leaving in silence, their eyes always drawn to the dog's unwavering vigil. Daniels came daily, bringing coffee for the nurses, sitting for hours watching the steady rise and fall of his friend's chest, whispering words meant more for Rex than for Jack. Then, on a morning when the sun crept through the blinds in slender beams, something shifted. Jack's fingers, long still, curled faintly against the blanket. Rex shot up instantly, barking sharp and strong, startling the nurses at the station. They rushed in, scanning the monitor, noting the spike in response, and Daniels bolted from his chair, his heart hammering. "Jack," he called, breathless. The shepherd whined, nosing Jack's face, licking his chin insistently. Slowly, painfully, Jack's eyelids fluttered open, unfocused at first, then narrowing against the harsh light. He coughed, once a weak sound, but enough to draw the room to a standstill. Everyone leaned in, waiting, but Jack's gaze moved past the doctors and nurses, past Daniels, and landed on Rex. His lips parted, his voice hoarse and broken but certain. "Rex." It was the first word he spoke, and it carried the weight of gratitude deeper than any sentence. The shepherd barked once sharp, his tail giving a single heavy wag before he pressed his head against Jack's chest, his body trembling with relief. Daniels turned away for a moment, his throat tightening at the sight of a man and dog bound closer than words. Over the next hours, Jack's strength returned in fragile increments. He spoke little, each syllable costing effort, but he never failed to reach his hand toward Rex, fingers curling in the shepherd's fur as though grounding himself in the loyalty that had carried him back. Doctors marveled quietly. Nurses smiled, and word spread quickly through the precinct that Turner had opened his eyes. Captain Richard Cole arrived by evening, his posture stiff as always, but his eyes softened when he saw Jack awake. "Good to have you back, Turner," he said simply. Jack nodded, still pale, his voice a whisper. "Not me, sir. Him." He tilted his head toward Rex, whose brown eyes stared back unwaveringly. The captain hesitated, then said, "The city wants to award you the Medal of Valor when you're well enough to stand." Jack's hand tightened in Rex's fur, his voice gaining strength through conviction. "Give it to him. He found Daniels. He brought you back to me. He never let go. I'm here because of him, not because of me." Daniels, standing in the corner, felt the truth settle heavy in the room. The captain's gaze lingered on Rex, who had returned to resting his head against Jack's side, as if claiming his place without needing any medal at all. "We'll make sure he's honored," Cole said finally, his voice carrying more gravity than usual. Jack closed his eyes, briefly exhaling, then whispered again. Good boy words meant not just as praise, but as recognition of the life debt owed. The days that followed carried slow but steady progress. Physical therapy was mentioned, strength regained little by little, but through it all, Rex never faltered. He walked beside Jack when he first tried standing, steadied him when his knees buckled, and curled beside his bed at night when sleep brought memories of gunfire and pain. Daniels stayed, often telling stories to lighten the room, always with a glance toward Rex, who seemed to understand each word. At last, when Jack was strong enough to leave the hospital, the precinct gathered to greet him. Officers lined the entrance, their applause restrained but heartfelt, and in front of them stood the mayor with a polished medal in hand. Cameras clicked, lights flashed, but Jack shook his head gently, resting his hand on Rex's neck. "This belongs to him," he said, his voice steady now. The mayor caught off guard, smiled slowly, and knelt, slipping the medal onto a ribbon that draped across Rex's broad chest. The shepherd stood proudly, his tail swaying, his eyes seeking Jack's approval rather than the crowd's. Jack smiled faintly, whispering so only the dog could hear, "We made it, partner." The applause rose again, louder this time, but for Rex it was never about ceremony. His place was already secure, carved into the bond of loyalty that had carried his handler back from the edge. And as they stepped together into the evening air, Jack leaning slightly on his cane with Rex pressed against his side, the world outside seemed brighter, not because of the medal, but because they faced it together. That night proved one thing: loyalty can outlast even death's shadow. Rex didn't just save a life, he reminded us all what true partnership means. What part of this story struck you the most the moment he refused to leave Jack, or when he led officers back through the city? Tell us in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. If this story touched you, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for more real stories of courage and loyalty.